You had someone who got a shoe in and was frankly not even a very popular vice president. So she didn't have that public appeal.
Republicans used to be the party of the elite and Democrats used to be the party of the working population. Donald Trump has made Republicans the party of the working class in many ways.
Last 2 weeks, the Donald Trump campaign was quite crude. All of this that seems so high schoolish, if like you had to do like a high school captain campaign.
India-US defense cooperation will continue to deepen, partly because of the Modi and Trump dynamic, but partly also because of the US-China situation at the moment. What does it say, though, about the world that we beat two women to win the presidency? I mean, yeah, US is not that far ahead after all. Hi, and welcome back to episode 33 of the India Dialogue. We're so grateful you're here. My name is Ruchir. I'm, as always, joined by my co hosts Mitali and Manu. Mitali is an acting director at the Reuters Institute, an author, and known for her time at CNBC. Manu is an advocate with his own law practice and a spokesperson for DMK. I'm Ruchir. I'm the chair at School of Policy and Governance and CEO at Distributed Energy. Every week, we try to unpack issues that matter to India in a meaningful way, look at different perspectives, and try and debate and discuss what it may mean for India. Today, obviously, we focus on the U.S. elections, given how big they are for most of the world. Mitali will set the tone. Mitali?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And I was just thinking back when we decided to sort of launch into this journey of a podcast. Part of it was to do with the fact that 2024 was going to be a big election year for India, and as it was for the world. And I think the events of the last week have sort of been a culmination of that. One of the biggest elections that everyone has watched out for has finally come to pass. If you've been living under a rock, then you wouldn't know of it, but otherwise, I'm sure you do, which is that Donald Trump has won the race for the presidency of the United States. It is a historic second term. Please excuse my cough. He passed the critical threshold of the 270 electoral college votes. I think what was a surprise was that till the end, a lot of people talked about a photo finish and that it would be quite tight. But if you just looked at a map of the way votes were spread over the country for him, it was quite an overwhelming win. And the big takeaway was that it's the economy is stupid. I think a lot of people came back in the post analysis saying inflation really, really hit deep and hard. And Kamala Harris just wasn't either the right candidate or wasn't at the right place at the right time. But that's what we're going to unpack, both in terms of what this means for India, but what the larger repercussions may be around discussions on democracy, discussions around strong leaders in the world, and what our takeaways could be. Manu, first sort of firing salvo from you on how you read this week's events.
Well, Mitali, I do agree that economy and economic concerns always play a massive role in the federal elections, and as it should rightly be. And of course, in the post-COVID, inflationary concerns were a huge influence in these elections. And Kamala Harris, having sort of had the burden of being part of the Biden administration and heavily involved in over the last 4 years, she had to carry that extra burden. But then, I mean, Trump's track record in the years that he was president aren't exactly, stellar or very impressive. Nor did he articulate very clear economic policies going forward, other than his usual sort of tax cuts and protectionist sort of tariffs and so on and so forth. So really, it's a bit hard to, I think, put it down to economy alone. And as with any other election, there were many others, right? And economics doesn't really fire people up. It doesn't sort of light that fire in the belly. So I would add two sort of fire in the belly issues to the mix. One was immigration, and other was sort of around actually, the voting and election fraud conspiracy theories in as much as how Trump and his sort of affiliates portrayed it. So, of course, immigration was always going to be something very sensitive, very controversial. Trump, right, going back to 2016 and the whole wall and everything, and, sort of harping on border security over the last few years, I think have made it a bigger issue than it was. But then I think it did have an effect, especially in swing states. I just saw a statistic today or rather, I just saw information today which points to the fact that Trump has won every swing state, and actually, it's a much larger victory than even we had thought or understood it to be on election day slash election night. And of course, the other one is around, you know, voter suppression, electoral fraud. This started from 2020, right? The 2020 election, and then went on till early January 2021 when Trump, famously refused to accept the results and sort of kept making wild allegations and accusations that the elections were actually, rigged. And this sort of has continued in some form or the other over the last few years. And even I think one of his big sort of affiliates, one of the big Trump propaganda pieces, so Musk had repeatedly mentioned that there's a lot of electoral or election related suppression that's being happening at the behest apparently of the Kamala Harris campaign. The last and the other sort of critical aspect that I would love to hear more from you guys is this is an election unlike any other in as much as you had a sitting president who did not seek re-election, seek his second term, and well, actually, who started seeking his second term and then halfway through had to step back, and Harris had to step in. So just that sort of dynamics was very interesting how that was actually done. I mean, maybe initially they thought it was done fairly smoothly, but now I think I'm sure a lot of fingers will be pointed at that sort of entire so-called transition and how Harris sort of came halfway into the race and then had to sort of catch up and so on and so forth. So maybe, I mean, I would love to hear what you guys thought of that.
Yeah, I mean, look at the time frame, right? And that was probably, if you wanted to trace back the loss of Kamala Harris, the place you would trace it back to is the switch between Biden to Kamala Harris, where there was no primary and she was anointed. If they had had some form of primary, they may have had a more popular candidate be able to run. The other interesting issues are, one of the things is that Trump voters are really motivated to vote for him, whereas the Democrats, at least, and similar to what transpired in the Hillary Clinton election, the Democratic voters here did not come out as much in force as they did for Joe Biden. And if you look at the map in terms of where Kamala Harris performed better than Joe Biden, it's like a very, very tiny number of counties where she's done better. So that was the other big issue, that the motivation factor was not as strong on the Kamala Harris end as there was on the Donald Trump end. The last comment I want to make on at least the results is, for the US, one of the big shifts that has happened in our lifetime is, Republicans used to be the party of the elite and Democrats used to be the party of the working population. And that has flipped quite dramatically in that, given the popular sentiment, Donald Trump has made Republicans the party of the working class in many ways, and Democrats now look like the party of the elite. Um, could they? I think they do better perhaps when they have more charismatic leaders. And I hate to say that because we had a female candidate, I think Kamala Harris did not have um, the chutzpah to get people out to vote. I mean, that is simply where it's at. Mitali?
Said rings true. It's also true that hindsight is always 2020, and you can look back and say, here's everything that went wrong. But I think it was really fascinating to just watch what was happening with sort of one of the most vibrant democracies, but also, if you go back in time, one of the most deeply polarized spaces. And that's how America has remained, you know. The first problem, as you point to, Richard, was the fact that this was a candidate who didn't even have the buy-in from her own party. It doesn't work. I mean, I think the deal with Biden when he took on the presidency was that he was going to be a one-term president. He sort of changed his mind towards the end. Then he had to be coerced, stroke pushed out of the space, which would have been a really good time to go back to the party and hear what people were saying. Who did they think was their best winning candidate? Who did they think represented their ideas? Instead, you had someone who got a shoe in and was frankly not even a very popular vice president. This is the reason in her last attempt at putting her ticket in as potential presidential material, Kamala Harris was what, fourth or fifth, I think, from memory. So she didn't have that public appeal. The second was wholly ignoring what was a unifying factor. And I know that in your last podcast where I couldn't make it, you all had Rajat on, and I'm very happy to eat humble pie about my observations on Haryana, where I thought the economy and the cost rise was really going to hit the electorate. But in America, it did. So, abortion is certainly something that affects a large population, but it wasn't the unifying factor. The unifying factor was buying a car 2 years back and then saying, I'd like to swap this up, and maybe it would now cost, from 350, maybe it's gone to 500, but no, it's gone to 750. What the hell? Biden's in charge. The Democrats are the problem, out with them. So I think inflation really bit very hard. Um, I will say it wasn't well documented, in the sense that till the end you kept hearing, oh, it's going to be really close, it's going to be really close. It actually wasn't. It was if you looked at the map, the sweep is quite overwhelming, including in traditionally blue states. And I think Manu is absolutely right about the point about migration, because even if you were to cut it across really, really so-called progressive spaces like New York, in boroughs like Queens, etc., a lot of people turned out as Republican supporters because of this continuing narrative around immigration and migrants. It's the same thing. It's the them versus us. If you look at the way the Latin American men voted, a lot of it is to do with that. It's that, okay, we're formalized. We don't want any more people coming in because they'll take our jobs and they'll just make the situation more messy. So I think, there's a lot of reckoning to be done. One thing that really worries me deeply, honestly, is where we go with climate. I know the Democrats and the Republicans have actually, they've been two sides of a coin. One just polishes themselves up better than the other. But I'd be really worried about where we go with climate policy, given what Trump's stance has been. But maybe this is a good point also to pause and talk a little bit about the India ramifications. I will say one thing as a journalist, though. I think what was interesting, and I know a lot of journalists are feeling quite burnt and bruised from this process, is how it got sort of reduced to being termed a podcast election. So you had Harris going on the Call Her Daddy podcast, and then you had Trump going on the Joe Rogan podcast, and almost being sort of declared a winner thanks to the podcast. Is that the truth? It's debatable. I don't think people make voting choices based on a podcast, but it's quite interesting how this genre really opened up, and how these were the spaces they were speaking in. But I think the bigger question for those who tune into our podcast is, what does this mean for India? So, let me go around the table again, Manu. There's so much rara about Trump from the Indian point of view, but what does it mean for the country?
Well, it's really hard to say, right? I mean, I quite don't understand, or it does not make any logical sense that India should be very excited or enthusiastic about a Trump presidency, because 2016 to 2020 did not certainly lead to any large, bilateral outcomes that we are particularly proud or India holds dear to. But having said that, Trump is a populist. Trump knows how to play world leaders, if I can use that word that way. He will, end up sort of doing the whole, Modi bear hug, and showing that he's warm, and he essentially comes across as a very sort of I would not say grounded, but he's a businessman who knows how to connect and talk to people, right? And he feels all of this can be reduced to a business equation. So I think really that's something we may have to keep a watch out on. Trump is a populist, so I don't know how many of those economic policies would really help India in that sense. So hard to really say exactly, what we can get out of this particular equation. But I think I've seen a lot of the BJP supporters get very happy on social media, and that's probably because they feel and they are, I think, quite certain of the Modi-Trump personal equation rather than any particular political ideological connection. Of course, you have the BJP, the Hindu right-wing party, and of course the Republican, right-wing conservative ethos, right? So I don't know if it's any such connection at a deeper level. Like I can understand the Conservative Party in the UK or the Conservative Party in Australia, which is called the Liberal Party, and Republicans have a common ideological platform, but I don't think it's quite the same with the Indian parties in that sense, right? Just going back to on one point, one thing I noticed around, and picking up on the podcast point that you just made, Mitali, which is that the campaign tactics of the Kamala Harris campaign and the Donald Trump campaign. The last 2 weeks, the Donald Trump campaign was quite, I mean, I found it quite crude, He drove a garbage truck to make a silly point. He, of course, went on a bunch of pretty ridiculous podcasts. He went and served food, or served fries, in a McDonald's drive-through, right? I mean, all of this that seems so high schoolish, if like you had to do like a high school school captain campaign, they would come up with something very sort of silly and crude but populist. Trump did, and he did it well. And of course, a lot of people would now, I think, say that that appealed or that connected with his core voter demographics, right? And maybe that is what you have to do. You have to reduce the campaign pitch to that level. I mean, the only person who I think was able to sort of strike a sort of high policy note and a very sort of simple campaign messaging was Obama many years ago, when he came up with something as simple as "Yes, we can," which is a very lower common denominator sort of a slogan, but also could rise to the sort of the highest policy making sort of nuances, be it climate change or economics or anything. So I think that was very interesting. I think Harris, based on what you both said, also like by virtue of having come into the equation or the race, when it was more than halfway through, and having been a vice presidents always live in the shadow of the president. No, I mean, though it's such a powerful position, you hardly hear them. They deal with really, really, low-hanging fruits in terms of difficulty. The press is rarely, on them. I don't think Harris even seemed like she was preparing for this eventuality. But I mean, going one step back, I found it very interesting. I mean, the US has the best functioning democracy, and by extension of that, the most sort of well-oiled political systems, right? The two parties, I mean, they've done this so well over so many years. I find it quite, strangely surprising that the Democrats didn't have they didn't think this through. They didn't think that there's a chance Biden may drop out or step aside, or what were they thinking? I mean, why didn't they have a clear plan of action, a plan B, a plan C? And by virtue of sort of going with Biden, and then everybody started speaking only when it was too late. I think they'd sort of let it. They lost this whole election. But not just the presidency, but if you look at the United States today, they seem to have lost the Senate, the Congress, most gubernatorial races, and of course, the Supreme Court has also been conservative for quite a few years now. So, really, all round, I think, like I said, very strange election to come back to it, which is that, again, I don't know what the history tells us, whether like a president who has skipped a term and come back. And I don't know if either of you know, does this mean Trump can now do two consecutive terms? Just this one, is it? Okay, well,
Well,
this,
constitutionally, you can't do 3 terms, but there is still a
but
constitution there that you that he has one whole term to sort of toy around with.
so it's
So,
not two consecutive terms, is what I mean. It's two
Just two
terms.
terms. Yeah.
Okay.
yeah.
And the last time a
Sorry,
president.
just one quick thing. Mitali, are you thinking that India should have brought that in sometime before 2024? Go on,
The,
Ruchir.
the less I think about what India should learn from these tricks, the better.
The last time that happened, by the way, where a president skipped in the US, like lost an election, came back a term later, was in 1892. So, in many ways, Trump has set history. What does it say, though, about the world that he beat two women to win the presidency? I mean, yeah, US is not that far ahead after all. One thing I wanted to say was, in terms of the results, the polarization was quite evident also in that if you opened X or Twitter, I mean, obviously, like it was completely Trump signals. And then if I opened Reddit, it was all Democrat signals. So in many ways, like who listens to what now has changed quite a lot as well. And you can tell by the platform you watch, whether you watch CNN or you listen to the Joe Rogan podcast. On the what does this mean for India? I just want to take a step back and think about what does it mean for the global politics, and then zoom into India. I think one of the few positives about a Trump presidency is non-interventionism for the rest of the world. The thing I expect, don't know how good or bad an outcome it'll be for Ukraine, but I expect the war to end. How the lines are drawn still remains to be seen, but I expect that the conflict will not last as much because the proxy, like US has effectively been fighting a proxy war with Russia, and I suspect that given Trump's ties with Putin, I suspect that war will come to an end sooner rather than later. The other thing that should play out, I think Trump was. I mean, that's the thing, right? He's been president before, so we know what he did last time. And last time he declared Jerusalem um, as the capital of Israel, and he declared that he will move U.S. embassy there. That also means that a two-state solution is much less likely. And in fact, what you will see is most likely is they'll go back to its ways of using aggression in Palestine. But it also means that you are more likely to see the Gulf states have deals with Israel again, which is what played out last time, and that means Iran should be surrounded, and Iran might feel pressured. The last thing is the U.S. China dynamic, which is an extremely important issue for India. I think Trump has been vocal and clear about wanting to build more manufacturing capacity in the US, less dependency on China, and has been vocal about China being a threat. And that what that does is because of India's situation with China, although now improved as of the last 2 weeks, um, basically means that India will continue a strong alliance with the US, especially through the likes of Quad and U2I2 and so on and so forth. The number of frameworks that India has created where US is a partner. So I think the India US defense cooperation will continue to deepen, partly because of the Modi and Trump dynamic, but partly also because of the US China situation at the moment. The last comment I'll make is around, there has been some conversation I've seen in Indian media around uh, tariffs on Indian goods being exported to the US. And I think um, uh, that's just the tool I believe that Trump uses to put pressure on India. But at the end of the day, I think India has also got very strong rules around what it allows into India, and what sectors India wants to protect. So my expectation is that that's just normal par for the course in the diplomatic relations. I don't expect that to be a big problem in the US India relationship, because ultimately we care about protecting agriculture and retail, and US will care about protecting some of its own homegrown spaces. So I think we'll continue to have that back and forth like India does with all countries. So that's sort of my view of where that Yeah, back and forth will go.
Yeah, I mean, just to use the same model, I think on global relations, part of what Manu was pointing to about the setup of the US and how it functions is also that the president isn't sort of, he's not this lone charger, just sort of, brandishing his sword this way and that. There are some checks and balances in place in terms of decisions that he takes, and one hopes that those checks and balances do prevent really rash decisions from being enacted. I think one of the most vulnerable blocks at this point is the EU, and I think they've been super concerned about the potential outcome, which is now a reality of a Trump presidency, and I think they would be very, very worried about where things could go from there. In the past, I think that's been the problem, right? There's no space for negotiation with someone like Trump. It's sort of, it's in or out, and he can just choose to get up and walk away from the table, which means that all the rules of international diplomacy as we know them are sort of upended, and you don't know in which direction conversations can go, whether it is, as I said earlier, about climate, whether it is about something as sensitive as conflict in the EU, which is the Ukraine-Russia war, or it's what's happening in Israel and now spilling over to the broader region. So I think we're certainly in for much more tumultuous times in terms of where international diplomacy and conversations go. On the local impact, Ruchir, I'm not certain how it'll play out with tariffs, and this has been his long-standing process of promise. The largest tariff increase, of course, for China, and then for countries like India. Now he has two problems if he does that. One, that he would be breaking a lot of international trade agreements, and second, that he would be basically importing inflation. So whatever it is, this person is also up for a midterm review, and if his voters find that inflation actually went up instead of going down after voting this person in, then they may not be a very happy set when midterm rolls around. Of course, the Democrats have a whole lot of work to do, but that's something to be aware of. For India, I think it's a little bit tricky. The US is not our biggest trading partner. The China remains so, but what we do also have is a currency that has not been very strong. It has worked for the Reserve Bank because they've basically been piling up, tons of dollars, and that's been great dividends for the government. But it would not be a great situation. We are also known to be pretty notorious in terms of, tariff agreements. So if people start gating us, then I don't think it leaves us in a great position. And the other one I would watch with concern around is visas. Trump has been very vocal about his stand on visas. This extends to, of course, student visas and worker visas. I think he's tempered it down a little bit in this recent campaign, saying, just the cream, just the really talented bunch will get it. But I think it makes life difficult, honestly, for students, for people wanting to come into the US, people wanting to bring their families into the US. That becomes a much tricky position from India's perspective. But it's important to see the difference that Manu has struck out here, which is that what happens between India and the US will could be quite different from what happens between a Modi and a Trump, because there's two strong men. There seems to be a philosophy that sort of matches up to each other, and it also looks like the electorate is sort of tilting towards that. That's the other problem with the elections. I think in the US, and this is excuse me, a lesson for India, it kind of degenerated into a class war, where people at the very bottom in terms of the economic pyramid felt, what the hell? Excuse me. Here's an elite party, which is the Democrats, and we just feel like we have no agency. And Trump, with all his chest thumping and saying down with the deep state, gives them that agency. So let's see how it goes.
And you just on that particular point, no, and I'm sorry, we're going back into some of the core dynamics that played out is this sort of false sense of, I think he called it liberation, or he once said, I will liberate America. I mean, what from? I mean, and it plays into your opening remarks, Ruchi, which is that, your perception, at least, is that now that whole which party represents the masses, as opposed to the elite, seems to have flipped, right? But I think that's part of this false consciousness or false narrative or false perception that Trump was so effective in setting, I mean, the poorest people who are sort of the, semi-legal immigrants into the United States, the African American community. I think they are the poorest, and in it's almost I think a great political narrative or operator who can set this sort of reverse context to make people who are actually better off in society feel like they are under threat, no? And I think there is an, according to me, uh, a similarity with Mr. Modi's campaign in 2014 also, where he created this fear that the Hindus are, though they are in majority, they are actually going to be in a lot of danger with if the Congress governments or the UPA governments were to continue. I mean, like I said, I'm putting it very crudely, very, very simplistically, but I think that's a great sort of political sleight of hand. But like I said, I don't have anything further to add really on the India repercussions, except like these are unpredictable, times, and Trump is completely a product of these times. So unpredictable. You don't know which way he will like wake up, and which country he will want to go after, right? Of course, in the past there was this anti-China sort of thing, but then, like I said, a good businessman is just waiting for the next good deal, right? Doesn't matter where it comes from. So I don't know what will happen, although I must say in 2016 to 2020, the quad formation sort of really did take off. So that is one geopolitical strategic initiative that India has been a part of. I don't know if the Biden administration gave it that momentum that it deserved, and maybe it sort of had its own other um, uh, challenges. But definitely, I see that picking up maybe more than the G20 or the G7s or anything like that. But I think it is time to move on, because we have one more short topic and then.
Again, sort of passing the baton to you, which is much more local, but I think huge in terms of the journey that has been covered by the Supreme Court, which is that the head of the Supreme Court, DY Chandrachud, retires on the 10th of November. It's the end of his tenure, and it's been marked by quite a few interesting judgments and quite a few that just didn't come up for hearing. And it feels like there's a lot of different views around what his tenure has looked like. Why don't you sort of sum it?
Yeah, I'll start, but I would love to hear, what others think. Mine would be more of a, from within the so-called establishment view, right? The Chandrachud tenure, so this is, the junior Chandrachud as opposed to his father, was actually one of the longest. The senior Chandrachud was the longest serving Chief Justice of India. So the junior actually served close to 2 years. And just to put this in comparison, the one before him, UU Lalit, served for 2 months, okay, as Chief Justice of India. So 1 year is a pretty good tenure for a Chief Justice of India. So two was extraordinary in these times, and of course, Dr. Justice DY Chandrachud, he had come through the sort of the judicial ranks quite young, and of course, there's always been this long-standing criticism, not against the Chandrachuds, but of nepotism and favoritism within the judicial fraternity itself, right? But there are two parts of the story. One is before he became Chief Justice of India, and then after. So before he became Chief Justice of India, some of his judgments were actually quite progressive. So I want to point out one when he spoke on the right to privacy under Article 21, and in that, a seven-judge bench of which he was a part of held that the right to privacy is a fundamental right and it cannot be sort of done away with, which is now spawned on and given many other very good judgments, protecting a person's right to privacy, even from a media trial, which the Kerala High Court held 2 days ago. Now, another very good judgment was in Navtej Johar, which sort of effectively decriminalized consensual homosexual relations. Again, Justice Chandrachud was a part of that. But again, once he became Chief Justice, now this is, I think, where the story gets a little bit tragic because one, as everybody knows, under the Chandrachud sort of Chief Justiceship, all the same-sex marriage petitions were pulled from the various high courts and were rushed to the Supreme Court for a very quick hearing. And it turned out to be not just a huge disappointment, but a massive setback for the LGBTQ community itself, where the five judges almost unanimously ruled that homosexual marriage is not a fundamental right, and marriage itself is only a statutory right. So if the state or the government of the day does not declare it to be something that homosexual persons can marry, then it so be it, right? Now, the other larger disappointment, more closer to the end of the tenure, was with regard to the petitions challenging marital rape, right? So these were again simmering for a while, and finally they sort of came in, and these were all listed in the last month and a half, but never heard by the Chief Justice's bench for reasons best known to them. The problem is stark when you think that the week or two after the horrific Kolkata rape murder incident of a doctor, Justice Chandrachud spent time actually, I think he read out a 20-minute statement, when he sat down for a hearing that day. Never done, according to me, in the history of the Supreme Court, where the Chief Justice of India read out a statement about how heinous this was and so on. Be that as it may, whatever the crime is, however however an open and shut case it is, the entire sort of judicial process must take its own course, right? But this whole sort of grandstanding towards gender justice and women's safety, but then a core issue like marital rape, which is such a low-hanging fruit, like Section 377 was never heard, and finally it's been sort of pushed down, it's been kicked down the road. The largest, I think, sort of tragedy of this whole thing was over the last 2 years, especially how crucial these years were leading up to the elections in 2024. A number of senior ministers, political leaders, and sitting chief ministers were arrested, all under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act cases. And again, the Supreme Court waited and waited. Kejriwal got bail after 6 or 7 months, Manish Sisodia after 18 months, so on and so forth, right? All of this under the eyes of the Chief Justice of India. There are one or two sort of, I guess, silver linings which involve the electoral bonds case where they finally struck down. But then even that, after so many years, after 6 years, where the electoral bond was pretty much now all the parties, even those who opposed it, sort of said, fine, we have to live with this now, and we will, gain from it, so to speak. So that's how it was. So very little
Manu, can I
silver
ask a
lining.
question? You've said this, and we've discussed this in previous episodes, especially about the judiciary in terms of the role of the Chief Justice and the other judges. How much of a role did the Chief Justice have personally around what cases make it in front of him and what cases don't? Because you're saying all of these cases that did not make it, and I'm curious, where does that burden lie?
So any judge has two roles: a judicial role and an administrative role, right? The Chief Justice of all the High Courts and the Chief Justice of India has a much larger administrative role, meaning they are called the masters of the rosters. So they decide who hears what cases, right? There's one particular allegation that over the last 18 months to 24 months, all the difficult, like the cases where the union government was particularly interested in, keep going to one particular judge's bench in the Supreme Court. So now the master of the roster has to take that sort of responsibility, right? And there were many advocates who, went and said that this is not fair. You're just sending us to this one person who's obviously pro-government. So that is that one. The other big administrative role that they have is to ensure that who are actually appointed judges, right? Somebody pointed out, I think it was Indra Jaising, a senior lawyer, that not one woman justice was made Supreme Court justice during Chandrachud's tenure. The two or three who are now or who were all appointed earlier. And of course, I think in terms of listing the cases, there is a certain discretionary element that any judge has, right? So on any given day, there are cases, and they do have an opportunity to pull up a case if they feel it has more importance, or if there is more, say, more senior lawyers involved, and or it will take up more time. So they can adjust their board a little bit. Of course, they don't have to justify to anyone, Ruchir. They can just say, look, we find as a bench, we find this is more important. We will prioritize it, right? In the past, we've had judges sit on weekends, right? One big sort of allegation or accusation against the previous Chief Justice of India, UU Lalit, was after this sort of almost 90% disabled person called Sai Baba, who got acquitted in a case by the Mumbai High Court. The government wanted to sort of keep him in jail, so they moved the Supreme Court on a Saturday. So Chief Justice of India Lalit at that time allowed a bench to be constituted on a Saturday, which never happened. So there are these sorts of things that often judges get accused of. But on the other hand, cases that you can pull to yourself, cases that you can list, there is some discretion in it, right? Usually they follow the chronological order, year wise, sequence wise, number wise, but there is enough. And the marital rape case, because I was following it quite closely, it was listed on a number of occasions. I don't know, probably like it probably went about 15 or 16 days listed for hearing, but was never heard. And then finally it was heard for a day and a half. And then, they said, oh, we don't have time to hear this before the Chief Justice of India retires. Now, I think an issue like that ought to have been prioritized, right? I'm sure others have different views on which issues should be prioritized, but I feel that was a huge slip, because something as straight and open and shut as marital rape, I think it was a great opportunity for Chandrachud to leave on a little bit of a shining, note, but I think he sort of has seemed to have missed that bus. What do you guys think? I mean, sitting where you are, looking at the judiciary, and I mean, he came in with a lot of promise, right? And he's definitely one of the most articulate, most well-read, capable judges that we've seen in the recent past.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think hopes were pretty high when he took on this position. And you've articulated it so beautifully, Manu. But it does go back to, and Ruchir asked a pertinent point about who decides when these cases come up. But it comes back to what all of us seem to, I think is the general principle, which is bail is the rule and jail is the exception. And whether it is civil society leaders, whether it is politicians, whether it is journalists, it just didn't seem like that was the barometer, or that is the barometer in function. And I'm thinking specifically of these two men, Dr. J and Sai Baba, who you mentioned, who came out and did a press conference and said it was a miracle that he had stayed alive. And very sadly, shortly after he was finally released, he died at the age of 57. And having documented living in extremely difficult circumstances within the jail as someone who was disabled. And the same thing for Father Stan Swami as well, who was denied sort of even a sipper for an aging gentleman. So I think that has really caused quite a lot of rupture in people who believe that there is a system and a process in the legal timeline, if you will, and it looks like bail just doesn't come up. I mean, how is it that Umar Khalid has just not had a bail hearing? It defies logic, that's one. And the other one is that, some of these roles, and of course there are sort of political tones and tenors to it, but some of these roles you think have scientific temperament and legal thought behind them. So when he goes out and does interviews saying that when he was trying to find a resolution to the Ram Janmabhoomi dispute, he sat before a deity and he said, you have to provide a solution. uh, I'm sure it works for some people. I'm just wondering whether it should be the go-to for someone who is the chief justice of a country. It's like, the head of AIM saying, I didn't know how to perform that surgery, so I went and sat in front of a deity, and the deity told me, well, you should operate tomorrow at 2 p.m. and then it'll be successful. There are spaces that sort of, lend themselves to scientific temperament. And I think that should be preserved. Ruchir, what do you think?
Yeah, so I don't have an opinion on the Chief Justice, but I think in India, one comment, and that's the only comment I have, we look at the High Court as a political, and it is an incredibly political body. And I mean for the masses, right? Obviously, the both of you are far more informed than, say, like me in terms of understanding the court process. And that's, I think, if it is a political body, what influence should it be allowed, and how should the people be appointed? And I think as a country, we don't think, or at least we don't talk about it. Perhaps the lawyers do think about it, but I don't think we talk about it. And I think we should. At least with the U.S., and you look at the appointment of like the Supreme Court judges and so on, it's a public spat. And I often wonder, why don't we have that kind of scrutiny on that process?
Very true, very true. I think they say the famous sort of Supreme Court adage is, sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? So, but one of the things that is always done in the shadows is judicial appointments. So they like to talk about sunlight, but rarely sort of it's shining on their own work. So that's how it's been. But on that note, is it the right time to move to have you heard? We've sort of all been, I think, busy following a bunch of things. But Richard, have you heard or seen anything that you would love to share?
My story is about sunlight. It's actually about, um, it's a strange science story I heard out of Israel. Research shows that plants scream, and they scream under stress and duress. But because it's at a frequency that we cannot hear, we don't actually know. But for example, they had these tomato plants where they did not give it water, and when it felt a serious need for water, I think it was making 30 to 40 clicks a minute at a certain frequency. So that was a really interesting science story I heard this week around. Plants have feelings too, and they express them differently.
Very interesting. Very interesting. That makes
Fascinating.
the whole vegetarian non-vegetarian debate a bit more
Yeah, and I
spicy.
wonder, I mean, water is such a clear connection, but I wonder, Ruchir, how they respond to pollution, for instance. Does that impact them? What about extreme heat? Are they screaming when they're feeling it?
Like the research specifically said under duress. It did not talk about the like many incidents that cause duress. So that's probably where they will go. What are the incidents where plants are under duress?
Very interesting. Well, Mitali, do you want to go ahead with
Yeah,
yours?
and I feel like this is a recurring theme. Maybe we should be called sort of the India dialogue stroke the tennis dialogue because we keep coming back to that. So on a recent flight, I had the space and the time and the quiet to sit down and watch this. And I watched 12 Days of Federer. I don't know if
Mm.
you've watched it. I'm sure Manu has. For those who haven't, oh my God, that's actually absolutely, it's a ball fest. Here are these sort of grown men weeping, and you're weeping with them. It's literally the last 12 days to the match that he finally played with Nadal and Djokovic and all these fantastic tennis players by his side. And it is such a tremendous testament to, I think, someone who is one of tennis's greats, if not the greatest. And it's so great to see how sometimes you think of a rock is like really difficult to move, but I think it's so great to see how two individuals, Nadal and Federer, decided to change the way competitors speak of each other, speak to each other, speak to each other's fans, and just create this community of two dedicated fans where they saw their icons have so much love and respect. And it can be done, and I think that's really the most incredible thing to see in the last few weeks. Of course, my favorite Nadal has also decided to retire, which is heartbreaking, but I think it was coming. But I loved it, and I howled and howled and howled and howled. It was like one of those really cathartic moments. So I highly recommend it for tennis fans and sports fans and any fans, really. What about you, Manu?
Absolutely, absolutely. No, no, it's such a lovely, well shot sort of documentary.
Yeah.
Of course, Federer also seems to have a very good team, which does all this. And right from you see the process from, when he decides to call it quits and how they go about planning that last, doubles and whatnot. And too bad they come so close to winning that match too. But anyway, I have like a really strange, have you heard, which is from the US elections, which is, again, we touched upon this, but then it's this, I don't know if you guys saw this huge political marketing, but masquerading as a lottery that Elon Musk came up with. So, just for people who didn't follow this so closely, so Elon Musk, set up what is called a super PAC, right? A big campaign contribution fund, and that he decided to give to 70 people $1 million each, I think, or $1 million a day, to people in swing states, in battleground states in the United States. And he actually, they set this up as if it was a lottery, like anybody could win. So why don't you, come in and whatnot? But then the Pennsylvania district attorney took them to court a few days before, and in court, Musk's lawyers admitted that it was actually not a lottery, but they did, actually give it to certain people whom they knew, who they were fairly certain would be Trump spokespeople, right? So they couldn't just give it to some random person who'd take it and then laugh at Trump and Musk's face. So anyway, it was really funny, and I think really that showed the level to which this elections had come to. It one of the richest people in the world, Musk, supporting Trump, and giving away $1 million in a fake lottery, really. So there you go, all in the name of free speech, apparently, and working for the, what do you say, Richard, like the Republicans becoming the party of the
And the
of
working
the poor
people.
and dispossessed.
Winners for the working class.
Um, and like I sometimes think if they just invited Elon Musk to the EV summit, this we would have not had the fallout that we did. I also don't buy lottery tickets because I don't trust the process ever.
But do you buy Tesla shares?
No. Sadly, no. I wish I had now. And that's all for this week. Thank you all for joining another episode of the India Dialogue. We're grateful that you listen to us. We love to hear from you. We welcome your feedback. You can email us at indiadialoguepodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on YouTube at India Dialogue Podcast. You can find us all on X or Twitter. The dialogue is at TID underscore podcast. Mitali is at Mitali Live. Manu at Manuraj1983. I'm at Ruchir underscore P. Thank you again for joining us and look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.